Ready. All right. Hello. Welcome everyone to Constitution Day, Constitution, Prostitution, and also happy Friday. Woo, we made it to Friday. I'm so excited that you all are here. We have a really engaging topic and an amazing professor, so I'm so thankful that you all are here. I just first want to let everyone that today is Constitution Day, so every year on September 17th, our institution acknowledges and recognizes this day. I also want to let everyone know Constitution Day is also known as Citizenship Day. This day commemorates the formation and signing of the U.S. Constitution, and more recently, President Biden proclaimed September 17th through September 23rd as Constitution Week, in which we celebrate the rights of citizenship in our Constitution. So for more information about Constitution Day, please go to www.constitutionday.com. So yeah, happy Constitution Day. And now, more importantly, we have our special guest from Stetson Law, Linda S. Anderson, and I will be reading a quick bio for her, and then she'll take over from here. So Professor Anderson has taught at Stetson Law since 2006. She also taught at Pierce Law Center, now UNH Law, and Concord Law School after practicing law in New Hampshire in the early 1990s. Professor Anderson's research and scholarly writing focuses primarily on legal aspects of alternative families, alternative lifestyles, and sexual freedom. Her most recent article, Ending the War Against Sex Work, Why It's Time to Decriminalize Prostitution, was published in volume 21 of the Maryland Law Journal of Race, Religion, Gender, and Class in spring of 2021. So this is our amazing speaker for today, Linda S. Anderson, and I'm going to let her take it over from here, and we can delve into the Constitution. Woo! Thank you so much.
Well, and thank you, Jada, and thank you folks for being here. I was really excited to get this invitation because I do enjoy talking about sex work and the law, the intersection of sex work and the law, to whoever will listen to me. And the fact that you folks are here listening is awesome. So thank you. If you end up talking about me or this presentation afterwards, just for your information, I use my she, her pronouns. So I like to make sure that folks are aware of that. And as Jada said, I've been looking at the intersection of prostitution and the law for a number of years. So I'm going to talk for a while about the connection between legislation about prostitution and the effort to decriminalize it, and the Constitution and the law in general. And you're welcome to jump in with questions. If you have questions, please feel free to interrupt me. But I can talk for a long time. I'm going to try not to talk for too long. And I will save time at the end for questions as well. So if you don't have questions in the middle and you think of them later on, feel free to jump in or save them till later. Go ahead.
I was going to say, we also have index cards if you want to ask questions anonymously. In the back, we have pinned and index cards, and then we can read them at the end.
So I'm very comfortable talking about sex. So just get used to the fact that I'm going to use the word sex a lot because that's what sex workers do. But we're also going to talk about the 10th Amendment. And when Jada asked me to do this, she encouraged me to focus on the 10th Amendment. And this is what it says. The 10th Amendment talks about how the power of the federal government relates to the power of the states. And it's not quite as exciting as the First Amendment or the Fifth Amendment or the 14th Amendment, but it is just as powerful. It does establish rights of the federal government and, most importantly, establish rights of the state governments. So the language here on the screen, I'm just going to read it because it is the focus of what we're doing today. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, and that's a sort of awkward phrasing, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. So that portion of the Bill of Rights was included to define the balance of power between the federal government and the states, and it essentially says that the federal government has those powers that are specifically identified in the Constitution. And anything that's not identified belongs to the states and the people. And so there's not a lot that is actually included in the Constitution as far as what the federal government can do. Over the years, we've found ways to allow the federal government to do more than we specifically find in the Constitution. But what you generally find in the Constitution is that the federal government can declare war, can levy taxes, can create the post office, can coin money, things like that. And the one that usually things fall under is can regulate interstate commerce. And that's the one that allows the Constitution to potentially influence prostitution or sex work. I want to talk just briefly about the terms I use. So, prostitution is a crime, and when we're talking about the crime of prostitution in different states, it's referred to differently in the criminal statutes. So you'll hear about someone being charged with prostitution or lewd and lascivious conduct. Sometimes is a prostitution-related offense. Trafficking certainly is. Solicitation is a big one. And there are a number of different prostitution-related offenses. So when we're talking about the criminal aspect of prostitution, keep in mind it's not just being charged with prostitution. It's probably also being charged with solicitation or some sort of lewd and lascivious behavior or pandering or pimping. There are a number of different ways that we refer to it. Before I go too much further, though, I want to acknowledge two things. First, for years, academics and researchers have been writing about sex work, and they have been doing so from the point of view of academics without any experience as sex workers. And they have essentially ignored the sex workers. So recently, I've been interested in this for about 10 years or so. And in about the last 10 years, sex workers have become much more adamant about having this mantra of nothing about us without us. They have fought really hard to have any people who are talking about sex work from an academic point of view, from an advocacy point of view, to at least have some conversations with people who are doing this work. And I subscribe to that mantra as much as I possibly can. At Stetson, where I work, I actually get to go to conferences where I can interact with sex workers. And I can talk to them, and I do talk to them. And I read what they write about things they want about their work, why they do this. I interact with them online. And I've actually found that there are a number of academics who are also sex workers, and I do talk to them as well. So it's important when you're thinking about prostitution or sex work that you recognize that these folks who are doing this work have a voice, and they have some really important thoughts about what they do and what we should be doing about what they do. So the other piece that I like to point out at the beginning is that I use the term sex work and prostitution interchangeably. Sex workers themselves, most of them, prefer the term sex work. And I just want to read to you an explanation of what sex workers describe sex work as. So this comes from a publication written by sex workers about why they use the term sex work rather than prostitution. So bear with me while I read, and it's not very long. Sex work is a broad term used to describe exchanges of sex or sexual activity. Sex work is also a non-stigmatizing word for prostitution. Not every person in the sex trade defines themselves as a sex worker or their sexual exchange as work. Some may not regard what they do as labor at all, but simply a means to get what they need. Others may be operating within illegal working conditions, such as pornography or exotic dancing, and wish to avoid the negative associations with illegal or informal forms of sex work. In addition to the exchange of money for sexual services, a person may exchange sex or sexual activity for things they need or want, such as food, housing, hormones, drugs, gifts, or other resources. And lastly, the term survival sex is a term that's used by many nonprofit organizations. Sex workers don't use this term most of the time. But it's used by nonprofit organizations and researchers to describe the trading of sex for survival needs. So that's what sex workers say about the way they like to be referred, and the fact that not all of them believe that, but we have enough folks who prefer the term sex work that I try to use that as much as possible. Now, the law uses the term prostitution, so you will hear me go interchangeably back and forth. What I'm talking about is sex work or prostitution that is illegal. So the illegal exchange of sexual activity or sex for something of value. That's our focus. There are aspects of sex work that are legal. So that's not what we're talking about today. Before we jump into the 10th Amendment and prostitution, though, I want to sort of set the stage here and allow you to do some contrast. Let's take a brief look at what we can do with our bodies. We can overeat, not exercise, become so obese that we need assistance with activities of daily living. We have that choice. We can starve ourselves to become thin enough to become models, to maybe work for a modeling agency that uses our body to promote their clothing line or other products. We can allow someone to insert ink into our skin to create tattoos for everyone to see. We can train and exercise and build and sculpt our bodies and then compete in bodybuilding exercises for everyone to see. We can pose nude for artists who actually capture our image and then sell that image for their profit. We can live in clothing optional communities. I live in the Tampa Bay area, so just north of me are a number of clothing optional communities. We can carry on our daily lives inside and outside, completely nude in those areas. We can offer our bodies for medical experimentation through drug trials, or as gynecological models, allowing a series of med students to prod and probe our genitalia and our reproductive organs while others watch. In addition, we can use our reproductive capacity to be surrogates, to create an embryo either with our own genetic material or to carry someone else's embryo and use our body to give someone another child. Yet for some reason, we cannot offer our body for sex if it involves the exchange of money. Now, many of the ways that I described are legitimate uses of our body for making money. Modeling, the gynecological medical models, those are all, you can actually go online and find job openings for medical models, and they get a salary or an hourly rate that's pretty substantial. In addition, as an adult woman, if I wanted to, I could choose to be part of the swinger lifestyle. I could have a polyamorous relationship. I could have an affair. I could have an open relationship. I could have multiple friends with benefits. I could have sex with other women or men or both. I could have threesomes, gangbangs, orgies, you name it. I can pretty much do anything I want sexually, including working as an erotic dancer, or get paid to have sex on camera and make commercial porn. And some, probably a lot, of folks would think that some of those activities are immoral, but none are criminal. Yet, if I engage with any sort of sex, in any sort of sex act with someone and I charge them a fee, I charge them something, whether it's money or credit on my rent or something of, I get something of value for it. All of a sudden, instead of just being immoral, it's also illegal. And why is that? Well, pretty much because right now the government says so. So which government are we talking about? Which government actually regulates prostitution? In some ways, the answer is both. The federal government, under the United States Constitution, gets to regulate interstate commerce. There's a lot of things they can do under that. They get to determine when people who want to immigrate come into our country. There's a lot that they can do with that. That essentially allows the federal government to regulate human trafficking. And human trafficking is a federal crime. There are also state versions of it, but it's a federal crime. And some people argue that human trafficking includes all forms of prostitution. I'm not one of those people. I'll make that clear right now. But certainly I respect the fact that there are others out there who do believe that any form of prostitution is human trafficking. And the federal government can make that a crime, can make engaging in human trafficking a crime. Under the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which we refer to as the TVPA, the federal government prohibits severe forms of sex trafficking. Not just prostitution, but severe forms of sex trafficking. And they define that as commercial sex that's induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or in which the person who's being induced is under 18. And in addition, the TVPA covers anyone who is induced into any form of labor by force, fraud, or coercion. So the TVPA is not just about sex trafficking. It's about sex and labor trafficking. But most of what we hear about it is the sex trafficking aspect, because it's provocative. It allows people to get really adamant on one side or the other. The federal government also, under the TVPA and some of the related legislation, provides incentives to the states to regulate human trafficking, to enforce human trafficking laws, and to include as many victims of human trafficking within that as possible. And that includes, in many states, a lot of consensual adult sex workers. There are a few other laws that affect sex workers, mostly federal laws. And these also fall under the constitutional aspect of interstate commerce. That's essentially where they get the ability to do this sort of work. I'm not going to spend a lot of time right now talking about these, but later on, after the presentation, if you want to go back, we'll start talking about Sesta Fasta or about the banking regulations that are affecting online transactions for anyone engaged in sex work, like PayPal, Venmo, and recently OnlyFans, and some of the COVID relief that was available. But because the federal government is limited in what they can do, the states have most of the power. The 10th Amendment gives the states the power to criminalize sex work. And when states restrict individuals, they're still subject to the rest of the guarantees provided under the United States Constitution, like the First Amendment right to free speech, the 14th Amendment right to privacy. So if engaging in sex work falls within one of those amendments, then, or any of the others, then it's an activity that's covered under the federal jurisdiction and not exclusively reserved to the states. But as we saw several years ago with the development of same-sex marriage, from civil unions to same-sex marriage across the country, decisions about what types of consensual, adult, intimate sexual behavior we want to engage in aren't always clear about whether they're protected or not. And until the United States Supreme Court actually identifies an activity as being protected, it remains something of the state's to be regulated in the way the state wants to do so. If it falls within those protections, then there's regulation possible, but it still has some limitations based on the constitutional protections. So that at the same time states are regulating or criminalizing behaviors, there are often fights in the courts about whether those behaviors actually are totally within the state's purview or whether they're protected by the Constitution. And that's exactly what's happened with prostitution. So I think it's also important as we begin to delve farther into what the criminalization of sex work does to folks who are working as prostitutes, that we actually think about who prostitutes are, who are sex workers. And when you actually get to know some of these folks and find out why they engage in sex work and what they do in addition to sex work, you discover that a lot of them, not all, but a lot of them are disabled. And they have a hard time holding a job because usually the disability is related to some sort of pain or illness that comes and goes. So they can't always go to work. They need flexibility. And having a job where they can control their schedule and cancel if they have to, it allows them that type of flexibility. A lot of folks who do sex work are also members of the LGBTQ community. A lot of them are persons of color. Many of them are single parents. Some of them are married. This actually, I have to be honest, when I first started looking at this, I hadn't even thought about the fact that sex workers do more than just sex work. They have a life. They're married, they have kids. Some of them are students. Some of them are professors or academics. That one surprised me when I actually got introduced to a professor at a university who is also a sex worker, currently at the same time. Some of them are authors. Many of them are authors. They have written a lot about what they do. Their mothers, their fathers, their siblings. They range from very young to very old. And some of them have turned into successful, prominent people. So this list up here, Roseanne Barr, Brad Pitt, Lady Gaga, Cardi B, Maya Angelou, Malcolm X, all of these are folks who acknowledge that they did sex work before they became famous. They may not have done it for long, but they did it. Prostitution is also, we know, illegal in all 50 states, with the exception of 10 counties. I always want to say 4. It's 10 counties in Nevada. And in those 10 counties in Nevada, the only thing that is allowed is to work in an established licensed brothel. So it's not like you can just engage in sex work on your own. You have to work for a brothel. It's heavily regulated. And it's not in Las Vegas. It's in the rural counties of the rest of Nevada. So that's what we're talking about with the people who do sex work and the fact that it's criminal in almost every part of the United States. So far, the United States Supreme Court has recognized that we get to make our own decisions about consensual sexual intimacy. We don't have to have love or marriage associated with it. We don't have to worry about other people's moral disapproval of what we're doing. And recently, at least in my mind it's recent, the court expanded this freedom in Lawrence v. Texas to include intimate conduct between consenting adults. And those of us who were engaged in sex work research thought, yes, This is great, because we figured we can make an argument that sex work fits within that. But so far, no court has accepted that. The courts are clear about a lot of activities that used to be illegal, now fitting within those protections and within those rights. So things like adultery and, what's the word for living with someone? But basically the interactions that we have that are fairly well tolerated by society are no longer considered illegal. Even if the law is still on the books, they're usually not enforced. But the courts make a distinction as soon as it becomes commercial sexual transactions. So what we do individually, in private, sometimes even in public, is legal as long as it's not commercial. The minute it becomes commercial, the court says, nope, no protection. And that leaves just, of all the sexual offenses, basically except for rape and things like that, it leaves just prostitution as being criminal. So the 10th Amendment gives the states the power to regulate or criminalize sex work. It has that power. But they can't do so unfettered. States are generally considered to have the ability to legislate to protect the health, safety, and welfare of their citizens. So when challenged, legislation is often evaluated by using one of two standards. So if someone thinks that the legislation is not appropriately regulating the health, safety, or welfare of the citizens, they're going to challenge it in one of two ways. They're going to basically say this is not legitimate to regulate, and if it's involving a fundamental right, a right protected by the Constitution, both the federal Constitution and here in Florida, the list of rights at the very beginning of the Florida Constitution, if it's one of those rights, then we end up looking at it under what's referred to as strict scrutiny. Question?
Yes, we got a question from streaming.
Okay.
It says you might mention this later, but wanted to put it out there. Would escort services be considered, or people who work on live cam sites?
Okay. So are we talking about escort services or camming, live cam sites? And the way I'm referring to sex work, the camming would not be included. Camming is not technically prostitution because there is no actual sexual interaction. Escort services are a gray area because it depends on what we mean by escort services. So if you're simply engaging in a transaction with someone to be your date and to go someplace with you with no expectation that there'll be any sexual activity, that would be perfectly legitimate. But when we refer to escorts, at least when sex workers refer to escorts most of the time, they're talking about escorts who also engage in sex. And as soon as there is that transaction of paying someone to be with you and engage in sex, then that would be the illegal part. That would be covered under prostitution. So when the statutes are challenged, if it involves those fundamental rights, then we've got what's referred to as strict scrutiny. And in those situations, the state has to prove that they have a compelling interest and they've used the means that are the least restrictive possible. It's their job in court to say, here's our compelling interest, here's why we're doing it in the most narrow way possible. But though many want to argue that sex work falls into those fundamental rights, right now no court has agreed that they do. So the other way that legislation about sex work is challenged is using what's referred to as the rational basis review. And under the rational basis review, the court looks at the legislation and says, the legislature must have had a legitimate reason for doing that. So we're going to assume that they did. And it's up to the challenger to point out that there's no legitimate reason that you can even come up with, even if the legislature hadn't thought of it. And it's not anything that the only reason, let me say that again, there's no legitimate reason that even if the legislature hadn't thought of it. And it's potentially just based on trying to enforce morality or animus toward a particular group. If it's just about enforcing morality, we already have a Supreme Court case that says that's not a legitimate reason. If you've ever heard of Romer versus Evans, that case was a United States Supreme Court case. Basically said, if all the state's trying to do is impose their version of morality on the rest of the state, that's not enough. And if it's all about just animus toward a particular group, feeling like that particular group shouldn't exist or shouldn't have rights, that's not enough. So then the question becomes, why do we criminalize sex work? What are the reasons that the states might provide for the prostitution criminalization that they have? And though they don't have to articulate these when they're challenged, they do articulate this as legislation is being drafted or as it's being amended. And at times, when it's being challenged, they'll put forward their arguments in general. And what we know is that the states that criminalize sex work, that criminalize prostitution, which is right now all 50 of them, say one of the reasons they're doing that is to protect the public health, mostly to prevent the spread of HIV or sexually transmitted infections. They also say that there's a heightened amount of crime in areas where there's sex work, that sex work causes more crime. They assert that they want to prevent human trafficking. They also say they want to protect prostitutes, those engaging in sex work, from harm. And they still throw in the moral standards, even though they're not supposed to. So over the last 5 or 6 years, courts have been confronting challenges to the prostitution laws. And these prostitution laws have been adding more and more fines and criminal records on people who are paid for consensual sex. There have been a number of cases where these purported reasons have been considered legitimate. But in 2018, in a case from California, the court held that a California statute making prostitution criminal was able to be enforced. So they upheld the statute. But at the same time, they said, we're upholding the statute even though we acknowledge that criminalizing prostitution doesn't make sex workers safer, that it actually makes them more vulnerable to crimes, and it doesn't significantly deter the spread of sexually transmitted diseases. So they basically flipped 2 of the reasons for criminalizing sex work on their head. But they said, we as a court don't have the power to change the legislation. It's not our job. So this is where, again, the setup of our government system and the way the Constitution of the federal government and the states separate the powers and create checks and balances. This is one of the results of that type of separation of powers. When the legislation is challenged, if there's a statute, the courts can only interpret it and apply it. They cannot change it. The legislature can change it. So in this case, this is Erotic Services, it's a big, long advocacy name. But in this case, the court basically said, we can't give you the relief that you want, but maybe you can convince the California legislature to do that. And as a result of that, the Sex Work Advocacy Network got enthused. And they picked up on that in a way that they hadn't been doing prior to that. They had little pockets here and there. But since that case, there's been a much more concerted effort to go to the state legislatures and to really work hard at getting them to look at what criminalizing sex work does to the sex workers. So let's be clear about this. The state legislatures have the power to make prostitution criminal. But the question is, should they really continue to do so? And as I was driving down to here today, I was thinking about the term prostitute. And, we think of prostitute as the person. But to prostitute something means basically to use it for corrupt purposes. And though I don't think that there's any intention of any state to use criminal legislation for corrupt purposes, we could look at what they're doing to criminalize prostitution and say, that's not the right way to handle your power under the 10th Amendment to legislate. Because you are essentially saying we're going to protect sex workers, but by making it criminal, you're creating more harm. So it was just, I hadn't really thought about that until I was literally driving down here, and I just thought that was an interesting way to potentially think about the term prostitute and what the power of the states to legislate is doing to the prostitutes. So over the last couple of years, in at least 7 states, Vermont, New York, Maine, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Louisiana, and Oregon, and in the District of Columbia, legislation to decriminalize sex work has been introduced to the legislatures. And in other states, like Wisconsin, California, and New York, in the major cities, prosecutors have publicly stated that they will not prosecute prostitution charges. We also know that public sentiment about prostitution has shifted. This is a recent national poll conducted by Data for Progress. They did this in November 2019. They did a number of these types of polls around the elections. And they found that a majority of all voters support decriminalizing sex work. And the strongest showing of support is from those between 18 and 44. But if you look at the blue, that's the people that support or either strongly support or somewhat support decriminalizing sex work. And then we have a group that are, they're not sure. And then we have some that are either somewhat opposed or strongly opposed. But consistently, when we look at this as a group, there's the public opinion about criminalizing or decriminalizing sex work has started to shift. Those who oppose sex work, those who want to continue to criminalize prostitution, are a small but vocal group of feminists. They're often referred to as abolitionist feminists or radical feminists. And there's a group of conservative traditionalists. This is a rather unlikely alliance. Usually feminists are on one side and traditionalists are on the complete other side. But on this subject, the abolitionist feminists consider any form of sex work to be oppressive to women. So they are looking to criminalize anything that has to do with sex work. And decriminalizing it in any way is just anathema to them. And the conservative traditionalists are interested in protecting traditional marital relationships and the male and female roles in those. So anything that might facilitate sex out of marriage is something they're going to fight really hard against. And these two groups, though they're small, are well organized. They have resources. They belong to places like academia, and they know how to get their message across. And they have the stories and the images, though they might be anecdotal, to get people's attention. And this is what those who are trying to decriminalize sex work have realized they have to fight against. Because when you talk to sex workers, you find that it's not like those images that we see. Yes, those exist. There are, I will never argue with anyone who wants to stop people from being victims of human trafficking. But not all sex work is human trafficking. So at first, the debate has been criminalization versus decriminalization. And then we added this middle ground that I'm going to talk about in a minute. But before we get to that, if the courts are saying there are legitimate reasons for criminalizing prostitution, then why is there still a push to decriminalize it? And that's where the public sentiment comes into play, but also where we've learned more, because sex workers have done a lot of the research, not only them, but we've learned more from sex workers and those who really pay attention to what it's like to be a sex worker about the reasons that the state has used to continue to criminalize. We know that sex workers and people involved in the sex trade fear law enforcement, that they fear arrests, that they fear the penalties. But it doesn't stop them. It doesn't stop them from engaging in sex work. Now, some anti-trafficking groups will claim that all sex work is human trafficking and that we have to abolish the sex industry. That's the only way to stop human trafficking. But the fact that we raise the criminal penalties on prostitutes actually keeps people in the sex industry. So those who are fighting to get people out by criminalizing it are actually making it harder, making it more difficult to get out of the system. Many people do this type of work because, as I mentioned, they can't hold a regular job. They need support. They need financial assistance and flexibility, and they can't find that in legitimate jobs. Again, many people belong to marginalized communities, and some of these are frequently targeted by the police. So you find that those who are poor, people of color, transgender, are frequently targeted by the police, and if they're doing sex work, they are on the police radar all the time. They can be arrested in many states for carrying condoms. Now, most of us know that condoms are a cheap, effective way of preventing sexually transmitted diseases. But when a sex worker is presented with the choice of carrying condoms to protect themselves and not carrying condoms so they don't get arrested, they might end up making the choice not to carry them. So they're putting their health at risk in order to avoid getting arrested. The other thing that might cause people to be arrested is the way they're dressed. I tried to find a suitable picture. There are plenty of pictures that I would have loved to have shown, but I just didn't think that showing them in public would be appropriate. But this picture right here, in some areas of some cities, if someone was dressed this way, they could be stopped and potentially arrested for solicitation, just by the way they're dressed. Police departments in major cities where they have task force that are out there looking to get rid of prostitution have a checklist. And they'll look at certain things, the way someone is dressed, whether they're standing in a place that's known to have prostitution, whether they're engaging in discussions with people. And if they check one or two of those boxes, that's enough to arrest someone for solicitation. And when they do that, they put down what the person was dressed like. Sometimes it's a short skirt. Sometimes it's a tank top that shows cleavage. If they came to Florida and did this, some of us would be in trouble. And they do it in Florida. But you have to also be in that location. But when you talk to sex workers, they recognize that if they get identified as a potential sex worker, then any of these things will trigger more police interaction. And that in itself is harmful, because if they're trying to avoid the police, they're going to move to a place where there's less safety, more drugs and crime, more potential for violence. And that's not protecting sex workers. That's actually potentially harming sex workers. When sex workers get attacked, when they are assaulted in any way, they can't go to the police without potentially incriminating themselves and being subject to arrest. So the fact that what they do is criminal means if someone attacks them, they don't have the remedies that we would have if someone attacked us, if we're not a sex worker. I won't assume that we don't have someone here that is. So keeping sex work criminal actually worsens the situation for sex workers rather than protecting them, and it potentially worsens the public health issues rather than fixing them. We have also the risk of the consequences of being arrested. Make it harder for a sex worker to get out of the industry. So think about what happens if you get arrested. You might have to post bail. You probably, if you have a job, once you're out on bail, you would go to work to get money to pay your bail and to pay an attorney. But a sex worker who does that is going back to a criminal activity and now is on the police radar. So that's one consequence of being arrested. But at the same time, think about what an arrest record can do to you in life in general. There are a number of jobs that you can't get with an arrest record, with a criminal conviction, with a criminal conviction. There are licenses that you can't get with a criminal conviction. You might not be eligible for housing. You might not be eligible for certain forms of financial assistance. And there's just in general the stigma. And I was made keenly aware of this the other day as I was reading an article in the Tampa Bay Times about the fact that in Tampa, the police, when they arrest someone, will notify that person's landlord. And if they're in public housing, if they are arrested, even if the charges are dropped, the landlord can evict everyone in the household. And they're doing that. So this story was about a teenager who had been arrested for some petty crime, and the charges eventually got dropped. But the Tampa police notified his family's landlord, and the entire family was evicted. So a criminal record, even sometimes just an arrest, has consequences that make it even more challenging to get into a different situation. So criminalizing sex work has these consequences, and certainly there are people who object to what sex workers do, and you have every right to object. But if the state's job is to protect the health, safety, and welfare of its citizens, is legislating in a way that criminalizes sex work actually doing that? And what we've found so far is that they're not. And the last part of this, the protection that some people think is a reason for criminalizing sex work, is about stopping human trafficking. What sex workers will tell you is that on the ground, they see who's trafficked and who's not. And they have a system, they have a community that watches out for each other. What we know about victims of human trafficking is that most of them get out of their situation not from law enforcement help, but from some community help, from some individual person helping them out. And sex workers have the ability to do that, but the human trafficking advocates refuse to see them as allies because they're still seeing them as victims. So the networks that sex workers have can actually help identify people who are being trafficked and can help get them out of that situation. Now, I've talked to sex workers who are victims of human trafficking or were victims of human trafficking. Some of them say, yes, I was trafficked. I started when I was under 18, I had a pimp, I was trafficked. But I got away from that. But I still engage in sex work now. I'm doing it consensually. So there is potentially a path from being a victim into being a sex worker. But that doesn't mean that any sex worker is still a victim. People do this by choice. They do it because they have, just like anyone else, they choose to take a job that may not be something they love to do. I worked at McDonald's when I was in high school and college. It wasn't something I loved to do, but it paid the bills. People who do jobs that are, not pleasant. Right now, healthcare workers working the way they're working, that's not a pleasant job. But it's what they do because that's how they make money. And sex workers would look at their position and say the same thing. I'm doing this because it's work I can do and because it is paying the bills. So I'm going to wrap up in just a minute, but I want to talk about end demand. The argument started between sex workers and those who want to criminalize it as criminalize or decriminalize. Recently, we've seen an effort by anti-traffickers, mostly, to create proposals for legislation that fit within what's referred to as the end demand model. End demand is also referred to as partial decriminalization or as the Nordic model, or in New York it's referred to as the equality model. I haven't quite figured that term out yet, but what this is it's a shift from the way we treat the prostitutes themselves. They are now considered victims under this system, and they don't get charged with prostitution. But everything around the transaction, the people who are purchasing services from them, the people who are promoting them as prostitutes, the people who are providing a place for them to do their work, and the people who are getting the benefit of the work that they do, including their families, are considered to be criminalized now under many of the end demand proposals. So if you've got a married sex worker who is trying to pay the bills to feed her family by doing sex work, under the end demand system being proposed in a number of states, not every state, but in a number of states, the fact that the money that she gets comes from sex work and it gets trickled down into her family would mean that her family members who get that benefit would be subject to arrest. We also know that sex workers often share space. They may share resources. That type of activity under end demand would be illegal. So yeah, we're taking away the one single prostitution charge, but they're usually enhancing the rest of the charges. So someone engaged in sex work is not going to be labeled a criminal for the prostitution aspect, but probably is for any of the associated activities. So obviously, my position has been through all of this that the ability to legislate, that right that states have under the 10th Amendment, doesn't require that states legislate. And since they have criminalized sex work, they have the right and the ability to change that legislation and to decriminalize it. And by doing so, what they would be actually doing is recognizing the right of every individual to determine their own boundaries about their private, consensual sexual conduct. And in other words, sex workers would finally be treated as fully functioning adults at last. So I could, as I said, I could go on and talk for hours about this, but I'm going to open this up to your questions, thoughts, concerns, comments. I'll go back and talk about other pieces. If there's something you think I missed, I'd be happy to talk about that. Yes?
Kind of interested in the intersection between and I wish I knew a little bit more about this, but I know there are certain websites and servers that have certain access to data, and I'm interested in the intersection like of that and of like online sex work.
Okay.
And like if there's any like legality issues around that happening.
There are absolutely a lot of legality issues around that. So the intersection between online sex work and access to the data that's online brings up a variety of legal issues. In, I think it was 2018, the federal government passed a law that we refer to as Sesta Fosta. And that law basically was aimed at stopping or curbing human trafficking. What it did was it shifted criminal liability from the people who post ads for people who are being trafficked. It shifted the liability so that the web hosts or the people providing that platform were both criminally and civilly liable. So Craigslist, a publication called Backpage, where there were a lot of erotic services advertisements, and a website called TER, the Erotic Review, I think, and a number of others, all hosted ads for different types of erotic services. And you know, some of them filtered out those that were clearly using underage people, that were clearly using victims of human trafficking, but they didn't filter everything out. And as soon as Sesta Fosta was enacted, those platforms shut down. Now, those platforms provided sex workers with the ability to screen clients without being face-to-face, so there wasn't the pressure to immediately make a snap judgment. It allowed them to do what basically create blacklists of potentially violent clients and share that with other sex workers. It allowed them to vet potential clients. You actually, if you hire a sex worker, especially online, most of them will require that you have some references, that you basically provide information, mostly right now, so that they know you're not a policeman or a police officer of any sort. So there's that aspect of it. At the same time, recently we've seen with things like Venmo, PayPal, and in a way OnlyFans, the banking regulations that control how those financial transactions get processed have forced those platforms to shut down anything that looks like it's making money from sex work. And that was the big sort of news that then became no news with OnlyFans. OnlyFans is a website that has basically made its money providing what people refer to as porn. And they made a lot of money doing that. And then one of the credit card companies that they work with said, we can no longer process your accounts because too much of it comes from illegal activity. So OnlyFans said, oh, okay, we're going to stop. We'll give you a little warning, but as of this date, we're going to stop allowing sex workers to do that kind of display. And many sex workers, especially during COVID, were making their money online. They were trying to stay off the street, off the interpersonal interactions, and shifted to online services. OnlyFans backed off of that because the credit card company apparently backed off of it, but they backed off of it for the moment. They are very clear that they don't know how long that's going to last. So the information that is online is absolutely scanned by a variety of entities, financial institutions, also the law enforcement agencies. So 2 days ago in California, this used to be a newspaper, then it went to an online service called Backpage, is finally went to trial. The publishers finally were on trial after a long, extended investigation. But if you read the reports of the law enforcement people about what they looked at on Backpage when they were looking for human traffickers, you see two things. You see that basically it was a great tool for law enforcement because they were able to see who was advertising for kids and who was advertising for people that seemed to be victims. So they could actually, they would scan that information and Backpage would sometimes send it to them. But at the same time, as soon as they shut it down, that tool disappeared. Apparently, the government, the law enforcement folks, mostly the federal law enforcement folks, said, you're not giving us enough, we're not getting enough detail here, you're still advertising too much that involves potential victims of human trafficking in whatever way they're defining that. So they threatened to shut them down. And right before Sesta Fosta was enacted, Backpage did get seized by the FBI, got shut down. Now the publishers are facing criminal charges and civil charges, and 2 days ago, because the charges don't involve human trafficking and the arguments that the prosecutors were making were all about human trafficking, the judge declared a mistrial. So they may end up being charged again. They may end up having the charges dismissed. It's still up in the air. But all of that's because of the surveillance of online materials. Yes?
Would you be able to talk about the legality of Epstein and what happened with his trial? Because he was trafficking minors.
He was.
But he was only charged with prostitution, right?
You know, I don't know for sure. I didn't pay close enough attention to his particular situation. My understanding is that he was not charged under the human trafficking statute. But that may be because it was not brought by people who had the evidence that it crossed state lines. But on the other hand, we had the Virgin Islands aspect of that. So I don't know the answer to that. I don't. Yes?
I have two kind of related questions.
Sure.
One is, what role, if any, do you think labor law can play here? I'd just be curious to hear you speak about that. And then, relatedly, you've been talking mostly about like kind of either legislative strategies for decriminalizing or legalizing sex work in the states, or litigation strategies in the courts. And I'm just curious if you think there could be kind of federal legislative strategy, or if the courts are super clear that Congress can't act here because it's under the exclusive jurisdiction of the states.
All right, let me take the second question first. There is currently proposed legislation in the federal government. I think I might even have a slide about it. Here we go. Called the People's Justice Guarantee. And this is a bill that has not been enacted, but it is a long litany of things that the sponsors want to decriminalize, essentially. It's a result of what happened over the last couple of years. And one of these includes decriminalizing consensual adult sex work. Now, the legislature potentially could do that. The federal legislature could, and then they would have to find a way to impose it on the states, and that might be in the form of financial incentives or refusing to prosecute things. But it's unclear whether this would be an actual mandate or if it's just a preference that things not be criminalized. If the federal government actually decided that they had the power to decriminalize sex work across the country, there would be challenges because it's a question of, do they have the power? I don't know for sure if they do. They'd have to make an argument that it fits under one of those enumerated powers, probably interstate commerce. And they've made that argument successfully with a number of other things, so it's certainly possible. Your first question, which I've now forgotten.
Oh, the labor law.
Labor law, okay. For a while there were a lot of advocates, mostly academics, suggesting that labor law would be another way to fight for the rights of sex workers. And that it's important to allow sex workers to have the protections that people have when they go to work, that they have the right to get insurance, that they have workers' comp, that they have all of the protections that have been fought for by unions and other workers. Sex workers, for the most part, have said, wait a minute, we don't want that. There are some who would take it, and especially if they're on the edge of sex work, so sort of in the sometimes legal, sometimes not legal, stripping, erotic dancing, massage, things like that. They would accept the regulation to get a safer workplace. But a lot of sex workers don't want any regulation. They want this to be basically independent contractor. The jury is still out on whether they actually understand that that would mean that they have no protections like we get when we go to work. But right now they're not, though there was a push for that, they're no longer pushing that. Yes?
Are there any major efforts in Florida to decriminalize sex work?
There's no proposed legislation that I know of, and I do try to keep track of that. There are a number of advocacy groups. There are a lot of advocacy groups. You'll find advocacy groups in every major city. There is a woman at USF St. Pete who started an advocacy group for sex workers who are in jail and who need services and need help getting out. And some of it is supportive work, and other parts of it are to push the legislation. You can find support groups for sex workers in Tampa, Orlando, all of the southern cities, but there's not a lot of major advocacy work publicly at the moment. I'm not a native Floridian, and I came here from Vermont and New Hampshire, and I have lots of thoughts about why that is, but that's more political than it is about this. But no, there's not. Yeah.
I have a question about, I know that not all sex workers are women and not all people seeking the services of sex workers are men.
Correct.
But I know that is, that there is a lot of that. So like, I guess my like question slash thought is, are there any efforts on the part of like law enforcement to maybe look for the people that are seeking out these services? Because it seems like a lot of the criminalization is falling onto the people who are doing the sex work. And if it's illegal to do sex work, then surely it's illegal to like purchase sex work and seek out a sex worker. So I'm wondering if there are any efforts or laws around maybe instead of criminalizing the sex worker or the sex work itself, criminalizing the people who seek this service, which is illegal.
There definitely is, and that's essentially what in-demand legislation does. But even without trying to enact more, there are laws right now that mean that someone who solicits a prostitute and gets arrested for that potentially faces higher fines than they used to. Some of them face jail. Some of them are required to go to what's referred to as John School so that they understand the harm of sex work. And sometimes, in some states, they are required to register as sex offenders. So there has been an effort to tackle this not just from the sex worker aspect, but from the purchaser's aspect. It still puts sex workers at risk because if a purchaser still is willing to go through that process, now they're also interested in avoiding the police so that you end up in transactions that are hurried and in situations where they're not surveilled very, very heavily. So if there happen to be instances of violence, the people around are probably not going to report it. But yeah, there is an effort, and it's an increasing effort to tackle this from the purchaser's point of view as well. And we see that with massage parlors and Robert Kraft, the Patriots football owner, who got arrested. I mean, they are trying to make examples of some of these folks, and they are trying to impose criminal charges on them as well. It's not being terribly successful because it's much easier to then just criminalize or build your arrest statistics with the prostitutes, because that's easier. You had a question?
I was gonna say, making purchasers, like criminalizing purchasers, harms sex workers too. So
Absolutely.
It's still not a good way to handle the situation. I was just gonna say that, but you already said it.
But you're right. It does. It is. So it might be a way to potentially decrease the amount of sex work. But in order to decrease sex work, we have to figure out why people are doing it in the first place and fix those systemic problems that cause people to have to make that choice. Because, you know, if they are struggling to find work that accommodates whatever issues they have, or they have drug problems and can't hold a job as a result, or things like that, there are things that need to get fixed on a societal level that might help us decrease the amount of sex work. But until we do that, it's not going to get decreased. World's oldest profession has been around for a long time. Any other questions? Anything online? Well, sure. I mean,
are there any models from other countries that you think are particularly successful and we should be looking at to kind of learn about the legal status of sex work?
sure. There's a lot of interaction with a variety of different countries. We know that the Nordic countries, Sweden and Norway, Denmark, have what's referred to as the Nordic model, the end-demand model. And there are studies about how that has worked. And it's clear, even the government says, still the whole purpose is to eradicate sex work. New Zealand has full decriminalization. And what they've discovered is that sex workers are no longer targets of violence. They are more likely to have positive relationships with the police officers, and the number of sex workers hasn't increased. So there was concern about, if we decriminalize this completely in places like New Zealand, will that mean that a whole bunch of people will then choose to be a sex worker? It didn't happen that way. The numbers didn't change, but the safety did. So New Zealand is an example of a place that has fully decriminalized. Australia has come close. It's not quite fully decriminalized. And a lot of the European countries have the Nordic model, the end-demand model. So we can compare them. And actually some of the, some countries, I can't remember exactly which ones, but some of the Far Eastern countries also have legislation. And there's all sorts of studies out there about how it's all working. And Canada is another that has less criminalized sex work than we have. So there's a lot to compare, but not a lot of incentive right now to do that. Yeah?
You mentioned that disabled people make up like a portion of like sex work.
A big portion, yeah.
In response to the pandemic and COVID, with things becoming more accessible online, but people also losing their jobs, how have the statistics of like sex workers in like the world and in America like responded to that?
I don't know that we have enough people looking at that yet, or enough data. What I can tell you from talking with sex workers is many who used to be street workers, if they could afford to do it, tried to find some online presence instead of interacting in person, at least for a while. And then a lot who had already been doing video cam work and selling videos and pictures and doing phone sex work and things like that, tried to get COVID assistance because they consider themselves a small business. And the COVID assistance regulations, at least at first, seemed to be excluding them. Now, the great thing about the sex worker community is a lot of them have a lot of expertise in various areas outside of sex work, and they all got together and figured out ways to convince the people who were managing the COVID funding that they still qualified. But it was a big argument, and for about 6 months, they were being denied COVID care money. But we don't. I don't think we have enough data yet. I do know that people are looking at it, beginning to write about it, but I haven't seen it.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else? Jada?
Well, I've been looking at the YouTube chat.
Yeah.
And there was something that someone mentioned about how people have been using Snapchat as far as sex work and how that's been problematic because of underage users. I don't know if you have like any additional comments or anything about that, but I did want to bring that up because that has been some engagement on the YouTube chat.
Interesting. I mean, Snapchat and TikTok and things like that are available to anyone do make it challenging for the platform provider. And the way that's normally been handled with any other platform, with Twitter, Facebook, the sort of long-term platforms, has been under the terms of service. And a lot of the platforms have basically, as soon as they see something, it gets flagged, they shut it down, or they suspended it for at least a while. So I don't know that, I wasn't aware of that, and I think it's interesting, and it's probably something that needs some follow-up, but that's as much as I know about it. So I want to thank you all for coming to this. As I said, I love to talk about this sort of stuff, and I know I often will talk over here and over here and over here about different aspects of it, because there's so much that can be involved in this. When I first started writing about this, I realized that I could write about this for the rest of my career, and I still expect to have a very long academic career. So I'm glad to see that folks here are interested enough to start talking about it. And thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. So I wanted to real quickly in the chat from our health educator, Susan Stawley. Susan wanted to bring up there is Cella Freedom, which is a nonprofit organization with programs based in Florida and in the Midwest with the mission to end sex trafficking and bring freedom to the exploited through 4 strong programs: awareness, prevention, outreach, and residential. They're based in Sarasota, and so there are volunteer and intern opportunities available. And so if you want some more information, you can reach out to our health educator, Susan Stawley, about that. So I just wanted to share that with you all. As well as, again, thank you all so much for coming. Thank you to the people who are streaming this on YouTube. We see you, we recognize you, we acknowledge you. And yes, we will do another topic next year, September 17th. And you all have an amazing, safe Friday. And we also have some extra apple pie as well as some pumpkin pie, which is vegan and dairy free. So feel free to get some extras. And so thank you all.
Great. Thank you.